George W. Bush has said he doesn't worry about what history will say about him. To paraphrase him, we'll all be long gone. If they're still writing about George Washington, I don't have anything to worry about. Our fourth story tonight, yes, historians are still writing about the Revolutionary War, the Civil War, World War II. And some of the writing about the latter has been used, and one person says abused this week, by Mr. Bush and his speechwriters. On Wednesday, the president told the Veterans of Foreign Wars Convention that the troops and the commanders need support and they deserve everything they need, boilerplate for any politician facing a room full of battle-hardened war vets. But then the president began comparing the fighting in Iraq to other wars. Political pundits suspect Mr. Bush is laying the groundwork for the forthcoming Iraq progress report from General Petraeus. Now, during his speech, the president used World War II in Japan as an analogy of what could happen in Iraq.
You know, the experts sometimes get it wrong. Interesting observation, one historian put it. He said, had these erstwhile experts, they're talking about people criticizing the efforts to help Japan realize the blessings of a free society. He said, had these erstwhile experts had their way, the very notion of inducing a democratic revolution would have died of ridicule at an early stage. Instead, I think it's important to look at what happened.
Now, if you look at the work of that author of that quote, you can just use the Google, you will discover he would not really agree with that setup. In fact, in an op-ed titled No Comparison, written in November of 2002, historian John Dower wrote, "Does America's successful occupation of Japan after World War II provide a model for a constructive American role in a post-Saddam Hussein Iraq? The short answer is no." John W. Dower teaches history at MIT. His book, Embracing Defeat, Japan in the Wake of World War II, won, among many awards, a Pulitzer Prize. Professor Dower, thank you so much for being with us tonight.
Thank you for inviting me.
And I have to give you full disclosure, I did not read all 680 pages of your book this afternoon, so forgive me if my questions are very basic. I understand you found out about the use of that quote through a journalist. Why did you become so upset? What was your initial response?
Well, I was a little surprised, and I was very distressed that the administration continues to misuse history in this way. They began using Occupy Japan as a way of prepping the U.S. for the invasion of Iraq, and they've continued to do so to the present day, and it's just a terrible misuse of history.
Now, in an interview with Politico.com, you referred to the use of your quote to draw this historical comparison between Japan and Iraq as, quote, really perverse. Now, perverse in the sense meaning the corruption of the idea. Specifically, what was corrupted or presented wrongly?
I think what's perverse is that they have continued to use Occupy Japan as an apt model for Iraq and what they're doing. And in fact, if you look carefully at what took place in the occupation of Japan after World War II, everything says this is entirely different from Iraq. Without these conditions, you can't expect this to happen. The occupation began in 1945, and most of the basic reforms, the great reforms, the democratic reforms, were completed within the first 2 or 3 years. We're still today sitting over 4 years, almost 4.5 years into the occupation of Iraq, and the country is in chaos. These models have no application. It's not history, it's propaganda that they're giving us.
Now, the White House has responded to all of this, saying Mr. Bush used the quote to in no way endorse his view of Iraq, only his view of Japan. Frankly, do you buy that?
Well, anyone's view of Japan, mine, but I think anyone who knows it, and certainly most people in Japan, the media in Japan responded negatively, very negatively also to that speech. Would say that everything in Japan was very, very different from in Iraq, and those differences are striking. And if the administration had paid more attention to them, perhaps they would have not been so foolhardy in the things they did. They do not use history for illumination. They use it to support propaganda.
Now, an editorial that you wrote in 2002 in a run-up to the war was really prescient. You predicted attacks on our troops and, quote, religious, ethnic, regional, and tribal animosities likely to erupt in post-war Iraq. Why did you believe this at the time?
Well, I think many people who knew Iraq very much were pointing out to the to the racial, to the ethnic, to the tribal and geographic fault lines in Iraq, which were just enormous. And anyone who worked on Japan, as I do, would say, well, what a stunning difference from Japan. There are no such fault lines and tensions in Japan. That was one of the many differences in Japan. If you went down the list, for example, and this was clear before the war, World War II against Japan was a formal war with a formal surrender. The Americans moved in and the Japanese government remained completely intact from the top to the bottom, beginning with the emperor through the central bureaucracy down to the towns and cities and villages. The country had great social cohesion. It had a deep national history. It had very strong democratic traditions back in the 1910s and 20s in particular, before militarism took hold. And if you sat with people from the Middle East who really were looking seriously at it, it was clear. They were all saying none of this is present in Japan. None of what was present in Japan is present in Iraq. And then if you go beyond this to other differences, one of the stunning differences is the Americans began planning for the occupation of Japan in 1942.
So the planning alone is enough.
So the planning alone, and it was taken seriously. And when they arrived in Japan, they had plans, and they had a very charismatic leader, General Douglas MacArthur, and he announced them very clearly and very swiftly, and they were a very competent occupation regime in those early years. So there was a competence there which added to their sense of legitimacy.
John Dower, historian and professor at MIT, thank you for your time tonight and for giving us a little bit of a history lesson. It was great.